Given that there are many properties of the range object, there are a few that are read-only. That is, you cannot change their value using the VBA, but it's still useful to be able to read this information. Now, a number of these read-only properties involve count, which counts the number of cells in a range, or column and row, which return the column number and the row number in a given range. So let's see these in action. If we wanted to count how many cells there were in a particular range, we could simply choose range, open brackets, open speak marks, A4 colon T6, close everything off, dot count. And you can see there it's in the properties list. Now that on its own does nothing but count, but it doesn't tell it where to put the number or what to do with the number. So let's be a little bit more controlled in our programming and create a variable to hold the count value. Dim count nums as integer. You're only going to ever have whole number counts. And then we'll declare count nums and assign our range count to go in there. And finally, just so we know it's working, we can then output that to a message box. Now for us to see the output from that message box, we need to just place this in a sub procedure, sub count test, move the end sub to the end of our statements, and then use the immediate window to test count test. 60. So there are 60 cells in the range A4 to T6. If we were to change that range, let's go to R5, much smaller range, and run our count test again. We end up with 6. So that's the count property. Simply dot count after your range object, and it will count how many cells are in that range. Hopefully you could see some potential uses for that. Similarly to the count, we have dot column and dot row, which are properties that tell you effectively what column you're in and what row you're in. So if we were to go, let's do the whole hog here, create a sub so we can output it. Column test. Let's dim column no as, again, that will be an integer because the column numbers are whole numbers. And let's set column no to be equal to our range G6 dot column. You see there it's in the list. And then we'll message box column number. So we can then test that in the immediate window. Column 7. Obviously, if you know your alphabet, you'll know that G is the 7th letter. Therefore, we're in the 7th column. So again, fairly useful little property. Now, if you were to try that on a range of cells, because I can see your mind whirring thinking, well, that's one column, that's easy. And we now run column test. What number do you think we'll get? Again, 7. Because although we've selected a range, it's returning to us the column number of the first column. Hopefully, you can now see some potential here, because I can get the column number for the first column in the range. Therefore, programmatically, I could move to the second column using our little cells property that we've seen previously and carry out some activity so far unthought of. Now, exactly the same as the column we can do with the row. So let's take the whole of that procedure, paste that in there, and just change column to row. So we're doing a row text. We want to dim row number, assign the row number, and message box the row number. And all we have to change here is the property to dot row. Let's test that. And the row is 6. Again, despite the range, it will give us the placement of the first row in that range. So already I know that 6 as a human, I can look there at the 6 and read it. But what we're doing here is programmatically finding out which is the first row in the range, and then we can step through, move to the next, etc. as required. The next read-only property is the address. Now by address, I mean an absolute address, a reference for a cell range. If we create ourselves a little sub, address, text. Now the address is not an integer, so we'll say dim add as string, and then let's set the add to be equal to the range. Now instead of giving it the cell references as letters and numbers, because that's what we're trying to read, let's use the cells property and go from 3, 4 to 14, 20. Close the range object, dot, and address is there in our list of properties. Let's find out what that tells us by using our little message box property to return add. So let's run this as a test. The cells we're referring to are D3, so we're seeing it in absolute $D, $3 to $T, $14. So here we're able to read the cells. Don't forget that these values here, the 3 and the 4 and the 14 and 20, could be variables that we're feeding into this little statement, and we can pull out of there into a string the absolute range references. So using the dollars to say this is the first cell, this is the last cell, there's your range. And that's referred to as the address. Again, it's read-only, like the row and the column and the count. You can only read this information and display it and give it back to the user, but you cannot alter it directly. We can alter these bits, but we can't alter what the address is feeding to us. Our last read-only property that we'd like to explore at this moment in time is the has formula property, which is a fantastic little tool for deciding or finding out whether a cell has a formula in it or not. So let's create ourselves a little sub formula test. Now, the value you will get back from has property is true or false. So that's a Boolean. So if we want to store it, we need to store it as a Boolean. Dim formula as Boolean. And then we can check. So let's set our formula equal to range of, let's pick on A1, dot has formula. And then we better output that so we can read it. False. So A1 does not have a formula in it. So let's go back and put one in there. Now it does have a formula in there. And we'll run it again. And we get a true. All it's doing is checking whether a given cell has a formula in or not. Now you have to be a little bit careful with this property when dealing with multiple cells. If all the cells have formulas, that's fine, we'll get a true. If all the cells do not have formulas, that's fine, we'll get a false. If some have formulas and some don't, then we'll get a null return value. And that cannot be handled by a Boolean, so you would need to look at another way of requesting this property. So you'd probably have to use a variant and check whether the return was a null before outputting to the user. So it's just to be slightly careful of. If you're checking a single cell, then it's fine. We'll take the result, we'll place it in a Boolean variable, and then we can use that Boolean variable either to trigger other actions or to return a result back to the user. So all of these are read-only properties. We have has formula, which decides whether a cell has a formula or not, returns true or false. The address property gives us the absolute range of letters and numbers, so the total range reference as we would recognize it from Excel. The row, which gives us the row number of a given range, or the first row in a range. Column, which gives us the column number, so it's got nothing to do with the columns across the top. It's the first column, second column, third column. And we have column, which returns the column number of the range that you're in, so the start of that range, or the cell if you have a cell selected. So our example was G6, so we ended up with a 7, despite the fact the range continued past G. And then count, that simply returns the number of cells in the given range. All very useful properties, all read-only properties.